Hi, my name's Hilary Stupa, and I'm a developer with qDABRA Software. What I'd like to talk to you about today is using qRules 4.2 Submit to SharePoint List. If you've used this command in the past with earlier versions of qRules, it's gone through quite a few changes for 4.2. We wanted to make it easier for you to submit to multiple lists from the same form. If you have been using previous versions of qRules, probably this walkthrough is not going to apply to you unless you want to update your form to use 4.2 mappings. If you have been using a previous version of qRules and you re-inject it with 4.2, your Submit to SharePoint List command will still work just as it is. So 4.2 is backwards compatible, but do keep in mind that this walkthrough is for 4.2 specifically. If you don't know what version of qRules you're running, go ahead and just open your injector, look in the lower left-hand corner, and you'll see a version number. If you see 4.2 point something or another, this is the walkthrough for you. Okay? To start with, I'm going to be using a form that I used in this blog post. So if you've read this blog post, the walkthrough for 4.2, this form will look familiar. If you haven't, that's okay. I know some people like videos, some people like blog posts, but just so you know, I've got kind of a companion series out here on my blog that you can look at that will also walk through this information. If you navigate to this blog post and check it out, you'll see that I also have included links to this form template. So do check out my blog on InfoPath Dev. Look for the Submit to SharePoint List walkthrough for 4.2. This post went up in May, so if you're looking through the archive, you could go check the May archive. That'll help you find it. It'll be at the very end of it. And so you can download these forms there, and that might make things a little simpler for you. For this walkthrough, I'm going to be using some SharePoint lists from a Northwind template that you can find online. The template is here at the SharePoint Bits blog. It's a fantastic Northwind template. If you're a little old school like I am, you'll know that Northwind was the precursor to the AdventureWorks sample database, and this blogger has put together a great set of list templates that you can use in a SharePoint site. It's fantastic. It gives you a nice set of kind of pre-linked data. So here's my Northwind site. It has all the lists I'm going to be using. If you download my sample forms, you'll find that they're linked to, of course, my SharePoint site, not yours. So you'll need to change those data connections and change those things in the mapping. Okay, so to get started, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create our qRules mapping for our list. Now, the Submit to SharePoint List command will take data from your form's main data source and submit it to a SharePoint list. But it needs to know what data you would like put into what column in the list. And so to do that, we provide it with a mapping file. The mapping tool is located in the Forms folder where you installed qRules. On my machine, that's right here in Program Files, qDABRA Software, qDABRA Rules Library, and here's the form. Now you can also find this in a Start menu shortcut. It is a full trust form, so you will have had to install it. We include install scripts for that, and there's more information on installing these forms in your user guide or in the installation instructions that can be downloaded when you download qRules. When you open this form, the default view is this Import Forms tab. You can actually, if you wanted to, use this form to import XML into a SharePoint list as list items. So the form has a secondary purpose outside of providing qRules mappings. In fact, that was its original purpose. So you can use this tool for that if you'd like. At this point, all we're going to do is use it for defining a mapping. So the first thing we do is we attach our XSN that we're going to be using for our mapping, and we enter the URL of the SharePoint site that we would like to submit to. Now, we will be adding a submit data connection to our form as well, but that data connection will always use the URL entered here in our mapping file. So qRules respects the URL in the mapping, doesn't really care about the URL in your data connection itself, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we're going to get our SharePoint lists right here. You'll note down here at the bottom there's, whoops, you'll note there's a new button if you've used this tool before to import an existing qRules mapping. So if you have an existing qRules mapping, you can just import instead of recreating. And in fact, after I show you just a few details here, I might do that just in the interest of time. Now I'm going to be mapping 3 lists: customers, orders, and order details. So I select the list that I'd like to map here, and I'm going to map my customers. And then in this case, my customer data is not repeating, so I go ahead and I just select my form field that I'd like to map. And I'm going to be mapping items from this section here in my customer section. The SHP ID is the field where I would like to have qRules return the list item ID upon submit. So you probably know when you add a new list item to a SharePoint list, every single item has a unique identifier. That unique identifier is an integer, an auto-incrementing integer. qRules, if you tell it, hey, I'd like that ID back in my form, will populate a form field with that ID value for you after the command completes. So basically it will submit your data to SharePoint, and then it will say, okay, do you have anything that you've marked as an ID field? And if you say, yeah, this is my ID field, either via a parameter in previous versions or via the mapping now in this current version, it will then populate a form field value with that ID. Why do you care? Well, yeah, I'm sure that's what you're thinking. You care because you may want to link your items in your XML to your SharePoint list, right? So you might want the next time you open your filled out XML to be able to update your list items in SharePoint. Now if that's what you're wanting to be able to do, qRules is gonna have to know what item to update, and the only way it can know for sure what item to update would be if you have populated the ID field. So for my customers section, this is going to be the ID field that I would like to have qRules populate with my list item ID. So I'm going to select that, and this is new also for 4.2, is here in my options I'm going to state explicitly that this is an ID field. So this is my ID, this is the field that I would like to have qRules populate with my list item ID. And then now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add just 1 or 2 more things here, and then we'll move on to the child list, and then from there I'll import rather than making you watch me map the entire thing. So now I've mapped my company name to the company name column. So I'm going to insert another mapping for this template, and this is going to be my orders. I'll scroll down here, and this is for my SharePoint orders list. Now in my orders list, this time my data is from a repeating group. And by the way, I tried to get real chatty about the help text here. So you're going to find a lot more help text in this form if you've ever looked at it before. And hopefully that will make it a little less confusing as you work your way through some of these things. At any rate, this data is from a repeating group. I've said that it is, and now I can select my repeating group. And if we go down here in our schema tree, again, my repeating group is my order group. So I'll double click that, and that's populated. Now the first field I'm going to pick, and you don't have to map your ID first, you can map it anytime. I tend to map it first just because that's how I am. You can see if you look at this, right, that this is the full XPath to the order group, and this is the relative XPath from order to SharePoint ID. So these are relative XPaths at this point. Up here they're full XPaths because we don't have a repeating group. So I'm going to add another mapping, and this time it's going to be my order number field, and I'll just map that to order number. Now one of the things I'd like to include here is my customer ID. My orders list has a lookup to customer ID, and I want to include that when I submit my order. However, as you can see, just like we would have in a properly normalized data source, I don't have the customer ID down here inside my order group. I won't be able to use the field picker for that. I'll need to manually enter a relative XPath. So in other words, starting here at my order, how do I get the customer ID field? Right? So I'm going to need a relative path that takes me from my order up to customer ID. So if we take a quick look here at our schema, right, orders is inside of customer, okay, just to make that kind of clear where everything is at. And I'm currently at my order. So .. takes me from my order up to my orders, and then .. takes me up to my customer. So now I'm at my customer, and what I want is my customer ID. So if I type in the correct XPath, including namespace, right, cust ID, and casing is right, I've got my capital C and my capital I, that's my relative path to that field, and I'll just use this drop down and select customer. Okay, so that's how you can create that relationship between the two. You just have to manually enter the XPath. If you aren't sure what the relative XPath would be, you can leverage InfoPath for that. Just open up InfoPath and start creating a condition on this my order in a formula, and navigate up to customer ID and then look at the XPath in the formula editor. So now I'm going to add one more child list, and that's going to be my order details. So here's my order details, and again, the data is from a repeating group. This time it's from the order details. I have to open this silly thing back up again, and down we go, and it's this guy this time. And again, you'll see we've got, you know, relative paths from here. I'm going to do my ID again and just show these guys and select him. And I'll add another mapping. This time I would like to get my order number. If you look over here, you can see that order number is one of my possibilities, right? And so again, the order number, I'm down here, I'm on order details. That's the repeating group. So to go back up the tree, .. that takes me up to, let me make this just a little wider. That takes me from order detail up to order details. And then .. takes me up to order, and then I can type in my XPath to get to the order number. So it's my order number, and I've made sure all my casing is correct and everything else. So if you're ever in your office and you're talking to yourself and you're saying, okay, .. up the tree, .. up the tree, don't worry, I'm talking to myself in my office too, because that's the way I figure out these XPaths, is by looking at the schema and just kind of talking my way through it. I figure out where I'm at, and I figure out where I need to go, and I just talk my way through it. So we've got kind of a little skeleton mapping here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and import my full mapping just so we can take a quick look at it. So I click the Import Existing qRules Mapping. I get a warning that says that this is going to overwrite the current values in the form. I'm okay with that. I'll say okay. And then I can navigate to my mapping, which is not there. Let me just grab it. Now, when we import our mapping, it does go ahead and populate this bit right here, the SharePoint URL from the mapping. You see it does clear out our source XSN, so it does mean when I say I'm going to import it, it does actually overwrite everything. And you can see I've got all of my mapping here now. The customers is all mapped this way. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove this, which was for an attachment, and that was for something I did at a later blog post. But otherwise, I've got all my customer information. Here's my orders. I've got all my order information, and you can see I've got quite a few things that I used relative path for to get the company name and so on. Interesting. And I could see that when I was first walking through this, right, I made a mistake because I did the customer ID for my lookup, and in fact I needed the SharePoint ID for my lookup. So that's something worth knowing, right? If you have an actual SharePoint lookup, then what you're going to need for your lookup is the SharePoint item ID. So for example, if your customer's SharePoint ID is 1 in the SharePoint list and your orders has a lookup to that SharePoint list, then you need to use the correct ID from your customer's list. Let's look at that in SharePoint real quick. So here we are, we're in my orders list, and you can see here's my customers. Now this is actually, this value that's being displayed is actually my customer ID, which is probably why I had that little brain trip and thought, oh, that must be what I want to map. But it's not. What I actually want is I want the item ID that this belongs to. Okay? And if you look down in the status bar of my browser window, towards the end of the URL that's being displayed down there, you can see in the URL there's and ID equals 34 right now. If we go up, and ID equals 79. Right? And ID equals 84. So those are the IDs for these different items, right? That's his actual SharePoint list item ID is 84. Okay? And so if we submit that, then the list knows what item we want from that list. So at this point we have our mapping complete. You can see here I am using the order number, and that's because that's just the way these list templates happen to be set up, is this particular order number is not a lookup. It's just the order number field. And now we can save this as a qRules mapping. Now when you save this as a qRules mapping, it's going to default to the name mapping.xml. Okay, and I'm just going to leave mine named that way. And I'm going to save it right here and overwrite my old one. Yep, I want to replace it. And now you could, if you wanted to, do file save as and save this whole thing, and then you'd have it there to reopen again. But I think with the ability to import now, I don't think that's quite as compelling of a scenario. Personally, I don't know about you, but my file system has plenty of stuff hanging around in it. So I'm going to go ahead and close this guy. No, I don't want to save your changes. Now, in this sample form, I already have a data connection set up for this, but I'm going to get rid of it so we can just walk through it. So let me just remove that. Okay, so that's all better. So the first thing I usually do is I add my file to my resource files. Let's just remove the one that's currently there. We're going to start from a blank slate. But there's another way you can do this too, and that is you can add it to your resource files from the data connection window. Now there's a reason why I do it this way. It's because that handy.xml file extension gets stripped off by InfoPath if you don't. But let me show you my latest shortcut for this. I just do an add. I'm going to receive data. It's an XML document. Okay, and then instead of doing browse and then saying, oh, okay, you can add this as a resource file, InfoPath, I go resource files, add, right, and then I add it this way. And you get to see my messy file system, right? There we go. And I add it this way. I say OK, and then next. And this adds it as a resource file. Now, I'm going to leave the name as mapping, and here's why. With the work on qRules 4.2, if you've used previous versions, you'll know that you have to include a mapping parameter with the name of this data connection. But that's all gone now if you leave your data connection named mapping. So name your data connection mapping. It's one less parameter you have to add. And since you can use a single mapping to submit to all the lists in your form, there's no real reason to change that name. And I'll just say finish here and close. Okay, now that we've got our mapping set up, I haven't injected this form with qRules yet, so we need to do that. And in order to inject your form with qRules, you have to close it. That's because qRules needs to save it as source files in order to add stuff to it and then pack it back up as an XSN. So we close our form. I'm going to save my changes, and then I'm going to inject my form. Get a little warning, and it's injected successfully. So now I've got my form back open in design mode. The next thing I need to do is I need to add a submit data connection. This is another thing that has changed between previous versions and 4.2. So let's walk through what the data connection looks like. Now, it looks like I've already added one. I'm going to go ahead and remove that, and we'll just re-add that. So let's add a data connection. Now, the thing we are submitting data to is the update list items method of the lists web service. So we're going to submit data to a web service, and our web service URL is whatever your server URL is. Then underscore VTI underscore BIN, whoops, that's not an underscore, underscore BIN / right? And then the web service name, list.asmx. We want the update list items method. It's right here at the bottom. You'll note these are not in anything like alphabetical order, so you just have to do a little hunt and peck there. Now, in previous versions of qRules, prior to 4.2, we had to set these parameters, but we don't have to set these anymore, so you can just leave these blank. Now, you're going to get a warning, right? You can see here InfoPath has said, hey, there's nothing to submit, but that's okay. You don't have to worry about that. qRules is going to take care of that for you. So you go ahead and just say, yes, I want to continue. And I'm going to give this a simpler name because I do have to include this as a parameter, and I don't like to type a lot. So this is my SharePoint list connection. And I'm going to deselect this checkbox. It's sort of irrelevant here, but you know, that's just me. And so I'll finish. And now I've got my submit connection. So my mapping is named mapping. This means I won't have to have a parameter for it. And my submit data connection is SHP list with a capital S and a capital L. Let's go ahead and close this. All that I have left to do now is add a method to allow me to submit my items. So I'm just going to put rules on a button. Now you could use submit rules for this if you wanted to. You've got all kinds of options. You could do it on a field change, for heaven's sakes, whatever works for you. Personally, for the sake of our demo here, I'm just going to add a button, and under my button properties I'm going to name it submit just for giggles, and let's say OK, and let's add some rules. Now, if you've worked with qRules before, you know the basic thing we're trying to do here. Let me just submit list items. Is we set the, let's go take a look at it, we set the command field. Right here, we set the command field to a specific value. Look through your user guide. There's 117 commands now, and basically you can set the user guide to any of these commands and all their different permutations, and the code behind will try to do what you've asked of it. Okay, so here we are back on our submit button, and we are going to be setting a field's value, and the field we're going to set is in our qRules data source. And it's the command node, and the value is just pretty simple, submit to SharePoint List, and all I need to tell it is what my submit connection name is. Submit equals SHP-LIST. Being careful to spell everything right there. Okay, this is all I need to do. Now, in previous versions, we would have had to add information for our ID field. We would have had to add information for where our mapping was. We would have had 3 submit connections and 3 different mapping files for this. But now all we have to do is have our one mapping file, our one little simple command here, and we can just say OK. Now, if you've had to listen to me natter on about qRules before, you will know by now that you really want to get your error note on there, because we all make syntax mistakes sometimes or other errors. And so it's good to have that on there so that you know what's happened when you've clicked your submit button. You know, once you've tested your form and it's all debugged and everything's working the way you want it to, you can take that off. Or if you'd like to, you can use it to add some sophisticated error handling to help your users along. So it's up to you how you deal with that error note. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to preview this, and we are going to add a new customer and some orders for that customer. Okay, so this form isn't super realistic in that you probably aren't going to be creating a customer and adding orders all at the same time. However, it works well for kind of a demo purpose because I wanted you to be able to see how we can submit to multiple lists at the same time. Now, if you had an existing customer you wanted to add orders to, you could have been copying that data into the main data source, and in one of my blog posts on 4.2 I talk about that, and hopefully I'll get another video done here soon with some more information. So you know, you can, with this new version of SubmitToSharePointList, decide to submit just individual mapping. So I'm just going to fill this out, and I've just added a little data. So I've got a new customer, he's got his contact information, here's my basic order. I could have added multiple orders if I wanted, and here's my order details, these 2 rows right here. And I'll go ahead and submit this. And I don't have any errors. Now, I probably should have put the success note on here, or I could have made sure my SharePoint ID fields were showing, so we could have looked at those. We'll just do a quick file save as so we can look at those in the XML. So here's my XML file, and you can see for my customer I've got a new SharePoint ID of 132. My order has a new SharePoint ID from his list, which is 893. Let me just clean this up real quick so that it's a little nicely formatted. So there's my ID for my order, right? And here down here in my order detail, there's one ID for an order detail, there's another ID for an order detail. Now my order number here is 13514, so we'll go take a look at that in SharePoint. And there it is. You can see it's my new order. If I hover over my customer number, you can see down there in the URL in the bottom of my browser window that the ID is 132, which is what we just looked at. I don't happen to have a title. I didn't have anything mapped to the title field. And then if we go to our order details, and we again filter on the order number, we can see we've got our products there. We can update this if we wanted to change this particular order. We could change this to something, I guess, whatever, chai, and we can just click submit again. Since we have our SharePoint item ID in our form, we'll be able to just update that from the Boston Crab that it was to the chai that it is now. We'll have to refresh our window, and you can see our item's been properly updated to the new item that we wanted to change it to. So that's that. I hope this was helpful. I hope you will give qRules 4.2 a try. Like I said, there's 117 commands in there. I added all kinds of crazy stuff this go round. We've got string commands, we've got math commands, we've got the financial functions from Excel in there. Just about anything you can imagine wanting to do in your InfoPath form you can now do with qRules. And the submit to SharePoint list changes, I think especially if you've had forms that submitted to multiple lists, I think you're really going to like how much simpler your forms are going to get with these changes. I think the mapping tool is easier to use, and on the whole I just think it's going to be a better user experience where you've got less things that can go wrong as you set it up. So I hope this walkthrough was helpful. Check out the posts on my blog for the changes for 4.2. If you run into trouble, post in the forum. I keep a close eye on the qRules forum. I want you to be able to use this product and succeed with this product. So thanks for watching. Have a great day and enjoy qRules 4.2.